vision, or have another print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hi, this is Jeff Shapiro, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Saturday-Sunday, July 11th, 12th issue of the Wall Street Journal Review of the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. A MAGA-friendly justice and the rise of a new conservative legal vision. Samuel Alito is fusing establishment conservatism and the Trump movement into a new legal doctrine. His approach to the law may outlast them both. During a little-noticed Supreme Court argument in March, one lawyer confessed to an unusual tactic. "I'm just trying to get Justice Alito's vote," veteran litigator Lisa Blatt said, as she was being peppered with technical questions about plea bargains. Both Blatt and her intended target were in on the irony. "Very few advocates have that goal," Samuel Alito deadpanned, drawing laughter in the courtroom. Alito was acknowledging what everyone around the Supreme Court already knows. His vote is rarely up for grabs. But on a court that has moved sharply rightward during his two-decade tenure, his near-certain embrace of conservative causes has made him a standard-bearer. The 76-year-old justice has emerged in the Trump era as the member of the court who is most likely to give voice to the populism and cultural grievances associated with the new right. And though people in his inner circle chafe at the notion that he is aligned with President Trump's movement, he has become the justice most likely to provide a legal rationale for the president's most ambitious policy goals. In 100 cases over the past decade involving a major Trump administration policy position, or in which Trump himself was a party, Alito's votes aligned with Trump 89% of the time, the highest rate of any justice, according to a Wall Street Journal analysis. When the sample is expanded to include all cases in which the first or second Trump administrations presented arguments, a universe of more than 300 argued cases and emergency appeals, Alito sided with Trump 79% of the time, also the highest rate on the court. Alito didn't respond to a request for comment. "I think there's a MAGA dimension to some of these opinions and votes that is not simply conservative traditionalism or restoration of the culture, let alone legal methodology," said Neil Siegel, a law professor emeritus at Duke University. "I think it's more focused on Trump. Alito cannot seem to vote against anything that the administration does. That's not true of any of Trump's own appointees or the Chief Justice." But Alito isn't merely a favored legal mind of MAGA world. More than any other judge, he has managed to merge pro-Trump, anti-establishment forces with the more traditional wing of legal conservatism, long dominated by groups such as the Federalist Society. In so doing, he is quietly charting the future of a conservative legal movement that is facing an identity crisis. His provocative approach, which he terms practical originalism, may also add legal ballast and intellectual heft to the future of the MAGA agenda after Trump is gone. Alito's own future is harder to predict. For months, rumors have swirled that he may be poised to retire, but conservatives are split over whether he should. Trump, uncharacteristically, has said he wants Alito to stay, and Alito has signaled that, at least for now, he isn't going anywhere. "God has gifted this man, Justice Alito," said Senator Mike Lee, Republican from Utah, who served as a law clerk for Alito during the justice's first full term on the Supreme Court and is a prominent within MAGA. He is the Mozart, the Michelangelo, and the Einstein rolled into one. When President George W. Bush nominated Alito to the Supreme Court in 2005, he was the epitome of a conventional conservative judge, a former prosecutor who had served in the military and the Reagan Justice Department. He immediately reshaped the court's ideological balance by replacing Sandra Day O'Connor, the ultimate swing justice, who had cast the deciding vote to preserve abortion rights, affirmative action, and campaign finance regulations. In the ensuing 2 decades, Alito helped overturn all of those precedents and even more. And since Trump cemented a 6-3 conservative majority on the court in 2020, Alito has come into his own, more frequently writing the majority opinions in significant politically polarizing cases. His legacy-defining achievement came in 2022, when he wrote the opinion that overturned Roe v. Wade and eliminated the constitutional right to abortion. In the Supreme Court's recently completed 2025-26 term, Alito expanded his corpus of transformative rulings. He wrote the court's decision this spring that dramatically narrowed the traditional scope of the Voting Rights Act. And on a single morning last month, he handed down 3 consequential rulings in quick succession, 2 that affirmed the president's immigration crackdown, and 1 that expanded gun rights on private property. Each of those decisions, all of which involved traditional conservative prerogatives, split the court along ideological lines. But the court's conservative majority is fractured over some of Trump's more unorthodox priorities. Chief among them this term were the president's global tariffs program, his attempt to remake the Federal Reserve, and his bid to end birthright citizenship. The High Court rejected all 3 of those policies, but Alito never strayed. In a term dominated by Trump-related disputes, he voted to uphold every significant Trump initiative that came before the court, and he wrote frequently full-throated endorsements of some of Trump's most brazen efforts to expand presidential power. In plain and punchy prose, he at times rebuked his fellow justices for not showing sufficient deference to the president. "I am stunned," he wrote in March 2025, when the court stopped Trump from freezing foreign aid. After the tariffs ruling, Trump said that justices who voted against him were, quote, low IQ, unquote, and, quote, weak, stupid, and bad, unquote. 2 of his own appointees, Justices Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, were an embarrassment to their families, he added. He suggested they, along with lower court justices he appointed in his first term, are insufficiently loyal to his agenda, and he has severed ties with the Federalist Society, the incubator for many of those nominees. Alito, too, is a product of the Federalist Society, but Trump is nonetheless heaped praises on Alito, calling him a brilliant legal mind and one of the great justices of all time. Last week, Trump said nobody could replace him. There is one other current justice who votes in Trump's favor at a rate similar to Alito, and that's Clarence Thomas. But Alito and Thomas often favor the same outcomes. They have starkly different postures toward the legal philosophy that is dominant on the right: originalism. Originalists believe that the Constitution should be interpreted in modern times according to how its words were understood at the time that it was drafted. The late Justice Antonin Scalia was the doctrine's pioneer, and its current torchbearer is Thomas, who is steeped in the academic literature that underpins originalist theory. Alito, by contrast, has a more complicated relationship with originalism. During his 2006 confirmation hearings, he never even mentioned the O word, though he did say the Constitution should be interpreted based on how people understood it when it was adopted. Throughout his tenure on the court, he has openly acknowledged the limits of originalism, occasionally scoffing at attempts by fellow conservatives to deduce what the founders would have thought. What Justice Scalia wants to know is what James Madison thought about violent video games, Alito quipped during a 2010 argument about a California law regulating video games. Did he enjoy them? But that doesn't mean Alito has rejected its mantle. The term he now uses to describe his original philosophy is practical originalism, an approach he says is less concerned with abstract theory and more concerned with allowing judicial rulings to function in the real world. He has elaborated on the philosophy in a handful of recent public appearances, and he is writing a book, due out in October, to defend it. He probably thinks academic theories of originalism can give you crucial guardrails about how to proceed, said Sharif Gurgis, a law professor at Notre Dame and former Alito clerk. But there will be many cases where the theory is just too abstract or too optimistic about what you can find to settle the kinds of hard cases that come to the Supreme Court. Alito's critics argue that the whole notion of practicality undermines the stated goal of originalism, to restrict the discretion of judges and strictly follow the Constitution's original meaning no matter what. They say Alito's approach is merely a cover for getting the results that he wants. I would describe him as an interpretive opportunist, said Phil Bress, president of the left-leaning American Constitution Society. Whatever theory of constitutional or statutory interpretation gets him to his preferred outcome is what he adopts. Alito's version of originalism was on full display on June 30th as the court issued its landmark decision striking down Trump's executive order on birthright citizenship. Alito argued in dissent that Trump's order was permitted by the original understanding of the 14th Amendment. He also recounted at length what he termed the story of illegal immigration in America and the failures, in Alito's eyes, of modern policymakers to address it. Echoing the language of the Trump administration, he referenced birth tourists, bemoaned sanctuary cities, and said the majority's ruling would produce grotesque results. While foreigners who wish to immigrate lawfully must sometimes wait for many years, a child born here to a birth tourist is automatically a citizen, Alito wrote. Thomas wrote a dissent in the birthright citizenship case too, but it was more academic, replete with arcane archival material about the history of birthright citizenship and the 14th Amendment. Alito's less doctrinaire approach and his eagerness to engage with real-world applications is more appealing to those seeking a legal underpinning for priorities like immigration and enforcement, gun rights, and muscular presidential power. Perhaps surprisingly, Alito, at his core, is a shy person. His friends and former clerks describe him as a quiet workaholic who tends to defer to others' peoples in one-on-one conversations. He is said to hate imposing any assignments on his clerks that would require them to work on weekends. He's proof that the introverts sometimes can make it on top, said Aaron Nielsen, a law professor at the University of Texas at Austin who clerked for Alito. Yet from the bench, his questions can be blunt, withering, and even sarcastic. When he doesn't like a lawyer's answer, or when he disagrees with a comment from one of the court's liberal justices, he has been known to grimace. Off the bench, he can occasionally provoke in ways that most of his colleagues do not, whether he's accusing liberals of jeopardizing religious freedom and free speech, as he did in a Federalist Society speech in 2020, or poking fun at foreign leaders who had criticized the decision overturning Roe v. Wade, which he did at a palace in Rome in 2022. Earlier this year, he marked his 20th anniversary as a justice. Some conservatives, despite their adoration for Alito, told the Journal that they would like to see him step aside while Republicans hold both the White House and the Senate. Alito's inner circle has tried to tamp down the speculation. People close to him say they don't expect him to retire this summer or fall, and in a strong indication that he intends to stay through at least June 2027, he has hired a full roster of 4 law clerks for next term, according to a person close to Alito. At the same time, he stays attuned to the political calendar. Some people close to him said they wouldn't be shocked if his plans change if a Democratic wave appears inevitable this fall, since a Democratic-controlled Senate would almost certainly block any Trump nominee. Alito bristles at the retirement speculation. Some of the people close to him say he believes he has more to offer before he leaves. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review and the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. One of his signature issues is religion. Alito, who has spoken about the importance of his Catholic faith, has long favored religious plaintiffs who claim discrimination or seek faith-based exemptions from the law. In the court's next term, which begins in October, the justices will hear its next major case on that issue, involving funding for a Catholic preschool that doesn't comply with state rules on LGBTQ non-discrimination. Also likely waiting in the wings is a case about whether Texas can constitutionally require the display of the Ten Commandments in every public school classroom. Another key area is gun rights. Alito has written two significant opinions expanding the Second Amendment, one in 2010 and one just last month. And it's an area where his supporters say his practical originalism shines. Next term, the court is slated to take up the question of whether the Second Amendment guarantees the right to own AR-15s and other semi-automatic rifles. And then there's abortion. In Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, the decision overturning Roe, Alito wrote that the court was returning the abortion debate to the states. But 4 years later, it is increasingly clear that the Supreme Court will continue to play a decisive role. In May, a majority of the court temporarily maintained federal rules that allow doctors to have the abortion pill mifepristone mailed to patients without an in-person visit. Alito vociferously dissented, accusing medical providers and abortion rights groups of effectively sabotaging the Dobbs ruling by mailing the pills to women in states with abortion bans. He chided Democratic-run states for passing shield laws to protect these perpetrators. He blamed the Biden administration for seeking to preserve abortion access after Dobbs, and he used the word scheme 5 times in his 6-page dissent. What is at stake is the perpetration of a scheme to undermine our decision in Dobbs, Alito wrote. That sort of language is precisely what liberal critics said that they find alienating. It's not just that they view his rulings as wrong-headed. They see his rhetoric and his approach to the law as dismissive and cruel toward people who aren't like him. I think Alito thinks of the other side as the enemy, said Eric Siegel, a law professor at Georgia State University, who has frequently criticized Alito. Alito is well aware of how he's perceived in some quarters. He doesn't seem to care. During a recent appearance at a judicial conference in Houston, according to SCOTUS blog, he said, "It would be consistent with my public image if I told you that I spent the summer catching flies so we could pull the wings off." Germany is beginning to forget the Holocaust. The country's post-war identity was built around its crimes. What happens now that it's fading? For Rudiger Malo, the first sign that Germans were starting to fundamentally alter the meaning of the Holocaust was when they started using it as a metaphor. It started during the COVID-19 pandemic, when opponents of social distancing measures began comparing them to the actions of the Gestapo. This kind of talk may be relatively common in places like the U.S., but it was new in Germany, where trivializing the Holocaust can land you in court. Did this mean that the Holocaust was being forgotten? Not exactly, said Malo, a German who represents the Jewish Claims Conference in the country. It's more that what the Holocaust represents for people is changing. Holocaust survivors who served as a living testament to the country's crimes are almost gone. By 2040, the number will have dropped to just about 21,300, a 90% fall from today, according to an estimate by the Jewish Claims Conference, which distributes German compensation payments to Holocaust survivors. Additionally, 38.1% of respondents in a study published last year by Bielefeld University said it was time to, quote, close the book on the era of National Socialism, unquote. It was the first time since the school began asking the question in 2018 that those seeking closure outnumbered those with the opposing view. And despite its prominence in school curriculum, young people in particular are ignorant of their country's history. Some 12% of Germans ages 18 to 29 had never heard of the Holocaust, compared with 5% of respondents across all age groups, according to a 2025 study by the Claims Conference. Some 13% of younger respondents said the number of Jews killed during the Holocaust was greatly exaggerated, against 10% of people overall. This comes as forces on the extremist right and left gain momentum. The right-wing Anti-Immigration Alternative for Germany, or AFD, that has advocated moving on from the culture of Holocaust remembrance is first in opinion surveys. Far-left groups, meanwhile, have called on Berlin to rid its foreign policy of its Holocaust baggage, a position summed up by the slogan sprayed on walls in Berlin that said, "Free Palestine from German guilt." All of this raises important and troubling questions for the country. Can a democracy built on a sense of responsibility for the Holocaust survive without it? What does it mean for Europe if the country that set the modern standard for combating anti-Semitism across the continent chooses to move on at a time of rising Jew hatred? And lastly, can a country that twice set the world ablaze and is now engaged in the largest rearmament effort in decades as Russia threatens the continent be trusted by neighbors if it abandons what has for 8 decades served as its moral compass? Out of the ashes of the Holocaust, Germany enshrined 3 core principles, says Liana Fix, Senior Fellow for Europe at the Council of Foreign Relations: never again war, never again Auschwitz, and never again alone. While France and the U.S. invoked the Enlightenment in their founding principles and constitutions, Germany built its post-war institutions on the memory of the Shoah. As Eternity Clause prevents key articles of its constitution protecting human dignity, democracy, and the rule of law from being amended. The Nazis' rise to power informs hundreds of statutes and constitutional provisions since the late 40s, banning Nazi slogans, removing Parliament's right to dissolve itself to prevent Weimar-era instability, and forbidding political interference in the media, the arts, research, and science. And the Holocaust became central to the school curriculum, in some cases including mandatory trips to concentration camps. Starting in the 1960s, a consensus was formed around the singular and specific horror of the Holocaust, its industrialized scale, its bureaucratic organization, and the totality of its focus on exterminating every member of the group. The memory activists, as they came to be known, came 20 years later, a grassroots movement of amateur historians, mostly non-Jews, born after the war. They felt ashamed of what they learned, channeling their emotions into a powerful remembrance movement, writes Jeffrey Katz, the child of German-born Holocaust survivors, in Unsettled Ground, Reflections on Germany's Attempts to Make Amends. Many young people in Germany are missing that personal connection. By 2024, some 40% of residents ages 15 to 24 were either migrants or had parents who immigrated to Germany, according to government data. For those under 15, the proportion was 43%. While there's little research about how they perceive the Holocaust, a 2010 poll for the Die Zeit Weekly showed that 68% of Turkish migrants in Germany said they knew either little or almost nothing about it. And opportunities for students to hear direct accounts from survivors are becoming few and far between as that generation dies out. Margot Friedlander, one of Germany's most prominent survivors, died last year at the age of 103. This fading memory disturbs Dervis Hizrachi, a former teacher and the head of the KIGA, a Berlin organization against anti Semitism. Hizrachi, a German Muslim with Turkish parents, says reclaiming that personal connection is key to preserving the memory. He himself became inspired to do this work after September 11th, when he was confronted by a teacher and asked to justify how other Muslims could have committed such an atrocity. Now he travels to schools all over Germany to talk to teens of diverse backgrounds about the history. You can take kids by the hand and get them all the way to caring deeply about the Holocaust, he said. You just need to make the connection to them. Only then will they open the door. Universalizing the Holocaust, however, has drawn criticism from those who maintain that it was a specific event with specific lessons and that efforts to expand its meaning into a broader definition of human rights has led to distortion given the difference in scale. Hizrachi pushes back against the suggestion that he might be watering down the Holocaust's unique character. Children, he said, including some who may be harboring anti-Semitic prejudice, needed a way to relate to the event before they could grasp its singular nature. To make a comparison between events isn't per se disqualifying. On the contrary, it creates connections, he said. When people here learn about the Holocaust, it's not like when others learn about antiquity or ancient Egypt. It's not just about history. It's about creating a collective identity that itself creates a collective responsibility. But holding that line has become harder amid more recent horrors, from the Syrian civil war to the staggering civilian toll of the war in Ukraine and the bombardment of Gaza. These events have both eclipsed interest in Nazi crimes and invited comparisons between the Holocaust and these newer conflicts. The accumulation of crises has made it harder for young people to focus on the past, says Matthias Thiel, head of the political education program at the Louise Schroeder Vocational School in Berlin. There is just too much noise. In the past few years, this tension has exploded across Germany. This was evidenced at a recent anti-discrimination celebration held at the Nazi-era Tiergarten City Hall in Berlin's diverse Moabit district. As a Jordanian activist of Palestinian descent was accepting an award, she told the audience that Germany was complicit for allowing a genocide to be perpetrated in Gaza out of guilt about the Holocaust, leading to rumbles in the audience. You can't compare, shouted a member of Keshet Deutschland, a Jewish queer rights group that was also being honored. You shouldn't say these things. The mayor of the district had tears in her eyes as she called on everyone to calm down and treat each other with respect. She was sorry, she added, if Jewish people felt hurt. Not just Jewish people, one person shouted. If Germany's insistence on remembering and learning from the Holocaust was once part of a global effort to immunize the world against anti-Semitism, it is now dimming as a beacon. Anti-Semitic incidents in the country almost doubled between 2023 and 2024 and reached their highest ever level last year, according to RIAS, a network of organizations that monitor Jew hatred across Germany. In February last year, days before a general election, a Syrian suspect was arrested after stabbing a tourist at Berlin's sprawling Holocaust Memorial, an attack police said was intended to kill Jews. In the state of Hesse, a group of men shoved a rabbi and stole his phone, accusing him of complicity in the actions of the Israeli government. In November 2024, Berlin Police Chief Barbara Solik urged Jewish residents to be cautious when visiting Arab-majority neighborhoods of the city because of hostility against Israel there. More than two-thirds of Germans think that anti-Semitism is rising compared with less than half of people in the rest of Europe. According to a 2025 European Commission survey, anti-Semitism has existed for hundreds of years, says Nellie Eliasberg, a spokeswoman for Values Initiative an NGO that advocates for Germany's Jewish community. It's a virus that mutates and against which people must be immunized over and over again. Since the start of the war, the right wing, AFD, has shot up in opinion polls, becoming the most popular party in the country for the first time since its creation in 2013. In parts of the former East Germany, where Holocaust remembrance was more muted until reunification in the 1990s, it is polling above 40%, making it possible that it could end up leading a state government there after regional elections this autumn. This has led to concern across Europe as Germany emerges as a regional superpower to counter Russian aggression, according to Fix, who wrote an influential piece about how the rise of the far right, which takes an anti-European Union posture, could be destabilizing for Germany at a moment of remilitarization. At the NATO summit in Ankara this week, new figures released by the alliance showed that Germany is spending more on its military in absolute terms than any other member, save the U.S. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review and the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. What if such a party were to take power in Germany newly armed to the teeth, she asks. What would its attitude be toward neighbors, toward the U.S., or toward Israel? Among AFD's distinctions, it is the only established political group to call for a change in how Germany remembers the Holocaust, raising the question of how it views its moral responsibility. Even if you think that only half of the 26 to 28% of the people who support them don't feel they need to honor the Holocaust, she says in an interview, that is still a big number. The spokesman for AFD, co-chairwoman Alice Weidel, didn't respond to a request for comment about the party's position on Holocaust remembrance. In a manifesto the party has published ahead of last year's general election, the AFD wrote that German history must be appreciated in its entirety. The official culture of remembrance must not focus only on the low points of our history. It must also keep the highlights in view. A people without national consciousness cannot endure in the long run. In its platform for the upcoming state election in the eastern German state of Saxony-Anhalt, it calls for ending the perpetuation of a guilt complex, refocusing the school curriculum on the creation of the Second German Reich in 1871, and restoring memorials to fallen soldiers. Early last year, one of the party's most prominent foreign backers, Elon Musk, live-streamed an address to an AFD rally in Germany saying the country should move on. I think there's frankly too much of a focus on past guilt, and we need to move beyond that, he told them. This troubled Danny Dayan, the chairman of Yad Vashem, who watched the footage on Musk's platform X. In May, he announced that Yad Vashem would open 2 education centers in Munich and Leipzig, the Holocaust Memorial's only outposts outside Israel so far. We're not coming to educate about the Holocaust in order to fight anti-Semitism, strengthen German democracy, liberalism, tolerance, and peace-seeking policies, but will it help? I have no doubt about it, Dayan said. It's, of course, an affront to the victims of the Holocaust to call Germany to abandon its culture of memory, but it's also an imminent danger to German democracy. At 82, Keith Richards isn't done yet. If it's just a matter of energy, yeah, we've got it. The Rolling Stones legend isn't ruling out a tour next year. Keith Richards doesn't seek out old Rolling Stones records unless he draws a blank trying to remember one of his many iconic riffs. I'm saying, how the hell did that song go? I better bone up. But eluding the music of rock royalty is no easy task. Richards has 4 adult children, and they'll play my stuff, he acknowledges. Sometimes I hear it on the radio, and it comes out of nowhere. In these moments, the guitarist is poleaxed like the rest of us. It hits me, he says with a devilish grin. Oh man, that's good. Splayed in an armchair in a midtown Manhattan hotel with views of a fog-shrouded Rockefeller Center, Richard still radiates roguish, live-wire energy at the age of 82. He fidgets with a pair of eyeglasses and points a knobby index finger to underscore a point, jiggles his leg relentlessly, and at one point mimes playing guitar. Wizened and creased, with a hoop the size of a quarter dangling in his left ear, he relies on gestures, shrugs, grimaces, guffaws, to flesh out responses that lean terse. He's discussing the latest Rolling Stones album, Foreign Tongues, which dropped this week and has brought the band together in New York. Mick Jagger is nearby, ambling through the hotel hallway. The Rolling Stones released its first new collection of original songs in 18 years with 2023's Hackney Diamonds. Now the group is putting out a second less than 3 years later, a rate of productivity unmatched since the 1980s. Their fans were reacting to the new music and they got a bit of momentum, says Andrew Watt, who produced the previous album as well as Foreign Tongues. Richards offers an alternate explanation for the burst of studio activity. Andrew's a little ball of fire, full of energy. He doesn't mind kicking ass and doesn't mind whose ass it is. With Richards' gnarled, withering guitar lines and Jagger drawing and disclaiming, there's no mistaking the band behind Foreign Tongues. The album was preceded in May by Rough and Twisted, a wandering blues number with riffs like Barbed Wire and In the Stars, which softens arena rock with polished backing vocals. Logan Peterson, a 25-year-old fan, calls the two songs head and shoulders above what they put out on Hackney Diamonds. I feel like they warmed up from the previous project, he added. After years of toiling and obscurity, this is their time, Conan O'Brien joked as he introduced the band to preview a few new songs from an admiring crowd in Brooklyn in May. When the Rolling Stones first arrived in the U.S. from England, it was another world, Richard recalls. We made it to America. You dreamt about that. The group's musical stew came from thoroughly American ingredients: ragged blues, chugging rock, narcotic country, and horse soul. Richards sometimes spent days without leaving the studio, a wily guitar work, dreaming up rugged riffs. Some 24 of these still have a visceral, immediate impact on a wide swath of the population, and the band released a series of fearsome albums between Beggar's Banquet in 1968 and Tattoo You in 1981. Most artists never come even close to striking greatness in the way that the Stones did once, Peterson said, and they did it 4 or 5 times. In Brooklyn, O'Brien marveled that Jagger sounds much like he did in 1968. I was taking a lot more drugs in 68, the singer replied. The fact is that he does sound the same, Richard says the next day. If he didn't, I'd fire him. Chuckle, chuckle. Bless his heart, he's full of beans, he continues, describing Jagger this way twice in 30 minutes and playing some really great blues harp on this record. Over the years, the relationship between Richards and Jagger has waxed and waned. One pole of warmth might be a pair recording Wild Horses, which came out on Sticky Fingers, a seedy jewel of an album from 1971. They both stood at the microphone together with the fifth of bourbon, passing it back and forth, and sang the lead in harmony into one microphone, the pianist Jim Dickinson remembered in Richards' autobiography, Life. At the other end of the spectrum, while recording the 1983 album Undercover, bickering and sniping, and barely able to tolerate each other, Jagger took the afternoon shift and Richards would work in the middle of the night so they didn't cross paths. The chapter of Life dedicated to this period opens with the line, "It was the beginning of the 80s when Mick started to become unbearable." Some friction is productive, but too much becomes a problem if the goal is to finish an album. While producing Foreign Tongues, he served as a buffer and a translator. My job was to take something that Mick thought Keith may not like and bring it to Keith if I liked it. and then maybe he did like it and would say, I think it could be even better if you do this. It wasn't always sunshine and roses. If you get your effing head chopped off sometimes. But then you screw it back on and you get up and you go for another round, Watt says. Today, Richards praises him for getting the hang of working between Mick and me. There are many different factions of Stones fans, each with their own idea about what the band was at its peak and when the band fell off. I don't like the production on the new Stones record is something people have been saying for 50 years, said Christian Bonner, co-host of Under the Radar, a Rolling Stones podcast. But even as the fans fire off hot takes, they keep flocking to the shows. The Stones remain stadium-filling stalwarts with more than $100 million grossing tours than anyone in history. At this point, the band's concerts elicit a twinge of awe that they're able to do this at their age, says Justin Sosa, who has seen 25 shows and hosts his own Rolling Stones podcast called Hang Fire. You walk away impressed, proud, pleased. Even if their mushy, emotional stuff is probably the last thing Mick wants to hear, you can't help but feel like, wow, look at these guys, they're still doing it. The band has not announced any shows in 2026, though, and speculation has flared online. Maybe this is it, and the group won't tour again. In recent years, Richards has suffered from arthritis in his hands. Possibly because the man once punctured a lung, falling off a ladder in his home library, and later fractured his skull tumbling out of a tree in Fiji, he brushes off arthritis as if it were a mosquito. It's not painful, it's benign, he said. It's just that I needed more space. So I made a few guitars that widened the headboard to give his fingers additional room to work. He ruled out hitting the road this year, but I don't see any reason we'll not tour next year, Richard said. Mind you, I could be wrong. He's floated the idea of trying a residency instead of a multi-city extravaganza. If it's just a matter of energy, yeah, we've got it, he adds. It's conserve and then open up the valves again. Learn how to hold yourself in reserve a little bit and play around with energy, rather than just smash into it. The new Little House series bonds mothers and daughters. Generations of women are tuning in for Netflix's adaptation of Laura Ingalls Wilder's series about pioneer life. Some families pass down lifelong loyalty to the Yankees or their alma mater. In the Yecke family, it's Little House on the Prairie. 3 generations of Yecke women have shared a love of Laura Ingalls Wilder's semi-autobiographical books about American pioneer life. Sherry Yecke, who's 71 years old, read the series to daughters Anastasia Good, who's 49, and Tiffany Brooks, who's 47, before they could even read, and then volunteered for bedtime story duty with granddaughter Bridget Brooks, who's now 10. A new adaptation of the series debuted recently on Netflix, and the Yecke women will be watching, joined by among the countless mothers, daughters, sisters, and granddaughters who have turned Little House on the Prairie into a multi-generational bonding experience. These readers say that the draw isn't just a vivid prairie setting, it's the story of female relatives navigating hardship together. It's really about how the women in the books helped the family survive, said Yecke of Searcy, Arkansas, who discovered the books on a 3rd grade library visit and figured such a beat-up copy of On the Banks of Plum Creek must be a sign that it's good. Over the years, she and her family have reread the books, watched and rewatched the NBC adaptation that made its debut in 1974, and actually planned family trips around Laura's world. In the books and TV adaptations, Laura vividly narrates daily life, recounting her adventures and mundane activities in such a way that many readers say that they see themselves in adolescent Laura. Those same young readers feel that they've grown with her as she matured from a rambunctious child to becoming her sister Mary's guide after an illness took her eyesight, to a wife and a grieving mother following the death of her son. Laura and I are similar in many ways, said Bridget. She didn't want to abide by typical rules. She wanted to be wild and play, I don't like being proper either. Despite their best efforts, some mothers weren't successful in getting their daughters interested in Little House until Netflix announced its adaptation. Rachel Collins, who's 50 years old, describes herself as a prairie girl and urged her daughter, Lily, to read the series when she was in elementary school. To her mother's disappointment, Lily preferred more popular books such as Dork Diaries. You're currently listening and reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. She even resisted when Rachel opened a used bookstore several years ago in Ohio and based her holiday windows on Little House, decorated with red mittens and lit up log cabins. But when Lily, who's now 23, heard about the upcoming adaptation, she listened to the audiobooks on her work commute. She found so much of it was familiar since she'd heard her mom talking about it her whole life. When the trailer for the adaptation premiered, Lisa Rubin, who's 60, and her daughter, Katie Tomatich, who's 34, dissected it together. Rubin loves the series so much that she almost named her daughter Laura. Her first observation? The bonnets look too fancy for the Ingalls family. The stories are timeless, said Shirley Casper, who's 49, of Menominee, Wisconsin, who started reading the books to her now 20-year-old daughter Gracie when she was 3. Gracie said one of her earliest Little House memories is visiting the family homestead in DeSmet, South Dakota when she was about 5, and the two have attended several cast reunions. We're still talking about Laura 150 plus years later, Casper added. Not everyone still knows the Little House star. After her mom introduced her to the books, 9-year-old Regan Day in Boston went in costume as Laura for her school's Dress Up as Your Favorite Character Day. Her teachers instantly recognized the pinafore dress and bonnet, but her fellow students didn't know who she was. That didn't dampen Regan's enthusiasm for the new adaptation. For the premiere, her mom, Alexandra, said that they planned to snuggle up for a mother-daughter night to enjoy the show. Obituaries. George Johnson, 1927 to 2026. He built an empire selling black hair care products. Johnson, whose company was an early sponsor of Soul Train, saw himself and his business as part of an ecosystem of black entrepreneurs that was mutually supportive. George Johnson's first breakthrough came in the 1950s when he started selling hair products to black men who wanted the sleek, straight hairstyles made famous by entertainers like Nat King Cole. His leap into products for women propelled Johnson Products to another level, fueling explosive growth and the construction of a sprawling Chicago headquarters. In his memoir, Johnson wrote that when the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. visited the office and saw black people working in jobs they'd so often been turned away from, in engineering, research, sales, the front office, he said, "Now, this is black power." Johnson, who died Monday at age 99, built Johnson Products into the dominant provider of hair care products for black customers in the U.S. and the first black-owned company to be listed on the American Stock Exchange. Its success made him rich, with homes in other places, France and Jamaica, and famous friends like Lionel Hampton and Ray Charles, who came over for barbecues. In November of 1999, when the Wall Street Journal looked at 10 people who transformed entrepreneurship over the past century, it included Johnson on the list, alongside the likes of Bill Gates, Sam Walton, Jeff Bezos, and Henry Ford. Not because of the size of his company or his personal largesse, but because Johnson Products Company became a nurturer and incubator for scores of future black entrepreneurs, and Mr. Johnson a shining symbol of black entrepreneurial success. The story of how business ownership in the 20th century spread beyond the domain of white males must include the story of Mr. Johnson. George Ellis Johnson was born in Richton, Mississippi on June 16, 1927, to David and Priscilla Johnson. The middle son of 3 boys, he was 2 years old and his mother was still a teenager when she and her boys moved to Chicago to live with her mother. George Johnson's son Eric and his father was given a roof over his head, but nothing else. He had to earn it. George had a job from the time that he was 6, delivering newspapers, shining shoes, and working in restaurants. In short, he became economically independent at a very young age, Eric Johnson said. To me, that's kind of the genesis of what would ultimately lead him to become an entrepreneur. George's and older brother John had something of a pact. When one of them got a job, they bring the other along with them. That's how George found his way to the hair care business. He dropped out of high school to follow John to a job at a cosmetics company, Fuller Products. Johnson and his wife Joan went into business with a local barber in 1954 to make and sell a product that they developed called Ultra Wave, which made it easier for men to straighten their hair and style it. The partnership with the barber was short-lived, however, and when Johnson went to a bank to try to borrow $250 to start a company, he was turned down. When he went to another branch of the same bank and asked to borrow $250 to take his wife on vacation, he was approved. Johnson saw himself and his business as part of an ecosystem of black entrepreneurs that was mutually supportive. Eric Johnson said this ethos had its root in his child in segregated Chicago, where George grew up and where black-owned businesses worked with one another. One firm's success fed the others. He hired and trained black men and women around the country on how to sell his products. He worked with black-owned ad agencies and law firms. He co-founded the black-owned Independence Bank of Chicago to give other black entrepreneurs a shot at capital. And when John W. Rogers Jr., the stepson of Johnson's early lawyer, created Ariel Investments, the first black-owned mutual fund company in the U.S., Johnson became an early client. His money and endorsement helped Rogers build his firm. He just loved our community. We also realized that if we built a stronger black community, we would all grow together, Rogers said. He understood that if we helped others achieve their dreams, again, we would all grow together. We would all rise together. For instance, before a group of entrepreneurs launched Essence, a magazine targeted at black women that began publishing in 1970, Johnson said in his memoir that he committed to years of advertising paid in advance. He also included subscription cards in his product packaging. Johnson used advertisements in print and TV to show black Americans in roles that they weren't typically seen in the media: politicians, physicians, flight attendants, and professors. When a Chicago-based television show targeted at black teens that featured black musicians wanted to go national in the early 1970s, he agreed to sponsor the show, prominently promoting Afro Sheen, developed as black customers gravitated toward more natural hairstyles. That enabled Soul Train to relocate to Hollywood and syndicate nationally. The show became a pop culture phenomenon that elevated black artists and celebrated African American culture. It was also great for Johnson Products' sale of Afro Sheen soared. Johnson's survivors include his 4 children and his third wife, Madeline Murphy Rabb, who he married in 2022. His first wife, Joan Johnson, died in 2019. George and Joan Johnson married twice. After meeting in high school, they wed for the first time in the 1950s, and she was an integral to the success of Johnson Products. Eric Johnson said that in the early days, while his father was on the road selling the product, Joan Johnson was in Chicago running the business. Their divorce in 1989 was acrimonious. In the settlement, Joan got control of the company. In his memoir, Afro Sheen, How I Revolutionized an Industry with the Golden Rule from Soul Train to Wall Street, Johnson is upfront about the fact that his infidelity played a large role in the rupture in their marriage, and that between his marriages to Joan, he married a woman named Renee, whom he had an affair with. His co-writer, Hilary Beard, said that he insisted in detailing his infidelity in the book as a cautionary tale to demonstrate what his behavior did to his family and his business. When they were back together but not remarried, Joan sold the company to Ibex in 1993 for $70 million. She didn't tell George first. The company has changed hands 2 times since. The couple remarried in 1995. In his memoir, George wrote that though he was initially furious about the sale, he decided to get over his anger quickly. If I wanted to stay with her, I had to forgive Joan from my heart, he wrote, adding, I knew I would never be able to sleep in the same bed with her if I held a grudge against her. And this one is from the book review section. The Cost of Being Close. A Terrible Intimacy by Melvin Patrick Eli. A common misconception about American slavery is that most enslaved African Americans lived on large plantations where contact with slaveholders was limited. In reality, half resided on farms in groups of 20 or fewer. On these land holdings and in their environs, proximity between white and black people produced surprising relationships. How did physical nearness bring individuals, regardless of race, together in unexpected ways? To answer this question, Melvin Patrick Eli delved into an unusual source, antebellum court records from Prince Edward County, Virginia. The startling results of this investigation appear in the book titled A Terrible Intimacy, Interracial Life in the Slaveholding South. Mr. Eli, a professor of history at the College of William and Mary, takes the reader into a courthouse where judicial proceedings unfolding during the first half of the 19th century. Witnesses gave testimony in homespun terms, and clerks transcribed their statements by hand. Juries deliberated and judges delivered sentences, some of which were commuted by the state's governors. A Terrible Intimacy features 6 cases that show how violence underpinned the kinds of personal closeness that slavery allowed or even demanded. Historians typically craft third-person narratives that impart a sense of objectivity and distance from the reader. Mr. Eli takes an unconventional approach by acting as a narrator and interpreter. His book reads as a conversational account peppered with occasional quips about contemporary political events. The 6 cases all confirm the centrality of brutality in slavery. First, readers meet Tom, an enslaved man accused in 1825 of killing his overseer on the property where he was held in bondage. Free and enslaved witnesses testified during the trial, providing evidence that attested to the close relationship between the 2 men who fraternized and drank alcohol together. Witnesses suggested that Tom had acted in self-defense against his aggressor after the 2 came to blows one day. Although Tom was ultimately condemned to death, Virginia's governor commuted his sentence to sale and transportation outside of the area. Another episode revolves around a significant fine issued to a 68-year-old slaveholder named Benjamin Rice. His crime? Hosting a wedding for an enslaved man and woman on his estate. His daughters issued written invitations to between 30 and 40 enslaved guests who gathered on the Rice property one evening in 1849. While Rice sat watching the festivities, the slave patrol suddenly arrived, rounding up and whipping the terrified revelers. Proximity, Mr. Eli observes, could sometimes produce an affinity such as we find between this enslaved bride and the Rice daughters, but there were other white people who wanted to police such affinities and were empowered by the state to do so. Living within the system of slavery, enslaved and free people talked, traded goods, imbibed, and celebrated. They observed one another's actions. They also turned to violence out of anger or to exert power. Although Mr. Eli's research shows that enslaved and free people engaged with one another in surprisingly personal ways, these trials also warn readers that focusing on the intimacies without recognizing the terrors obscures the fundamental character of a system that indeed poisoned and depraved everything that it touched. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the July 11-12 issue of the Wall Street Journal Review. We read from the Wall Street Journal Review every Thursday at 7 p.m. Your reader has been Jeff Shapiro. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have the New York Times. At 9 o'clock, we have Harper's Magazine, and at 10 o'clock, we have episode number 3 of Hope Rises by David Baldacci. Stay with us. If you or people you know shop at any of the Dash's supermarkets, please save Dash's register tapes for radio reading. Our agency receives. The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability